pursue all of this work. My special theme today is the intrinsic vulnerability of control systems and how they might help to explain disease heritability. Really, our goal here is to pull together people working in adjacent areas. We've talked about the intersection of medicine and evolutionary biology a lot. I think adding in control systems can bring something special to bear, because I never realized it before, but there aren't just control systems controlling blood pressure and glucose. Every single gene is regulated. There are not just 1,000 regulation systems, there are tens of thousands. How do you get tens of thousands of regulation systems from only 20,000 genes? Our grasp of the body is still coming along. Furthermore, disease is dysregulated control systems. We can think about disease in those terms. That's the intersection that I think offers a huge opportunity. There are a bunch of people working in that area. I think more of us getting together there and sharing our ideas would be very productive. I got into this really because of work in an anxiety disorders clinic at University of Michigan, where only after 10 years, it had become clear to me that really these were dysregulated control systems. They were runaway, nasty, vicious cycles. For performance anxiety, it's obvious. Those of us giving a talk like me right now, you get a little bit nervous and your voice cracks, you forget what you're doing, you press the wrong button, and then you start worrying, oh my gosh, am I going to get anxious? Is that going to cause more problems? Bad enough when you're performing or in sports or something. Sex is a real one. One failure in performance makes people so anxious that it causes more, and then you're off to the races with bad problems. Do you know that there are thousands of people who can't go to the bathroom in a public bathroom because their bladders won't release when they're anxious? And of course, once you start worrying about that, it just gets worse. Panic attacks also, and a really simple one we all experience is insomnia. I've got to get a good sleep tonight. Well, that's a perfect recipe, of course, for being anxious about it and not getting a good sleep. Turns out that this basic idea applies lots of other places too, and eating disorders in particular. If you have a desperate fear of obesity and you demand to get thin, you're liable to just stop eating for a few days to try to lose your weight. And guess what? That reliably causes binge eating and weight gain, causing more fear of obesity. Now, the fear of obesity and the wish for thinness comes from other sources. And Dr. EvMed has written profoundly about sexual competition. But I think this is the nasty cycle that perpetuates eating disorders. Congestive heart failure is another one. George Williams and I wrote about this years ago. When the heart isn't pumping enough, the signal is you better load more fluid on. And indeed, the kidneys do start bringing on more fluid. And that paradoxically, because the heart usually is pushed past the Starling point, makes it worse yet. And this is where heart failure goes into a positive feedback vicious cycle. So I tried to understand all this more deeply. And if any of you followed along with control systems, you have probably experienced the same frustration I have, because different names are given to different boxes and everybody draws things differently. And if you look at books called Control System for Dummies or Introduction to Control Systems, almost all of them by the third page are into calculus. And it's important because that's how engineers manage control systems. You really have to follow some of it. But here's the simplest possible diagram I can provide for you. You got to control temperature, either of your body or a room. And it turns out that temperature is measured by a sensor and compared to a set point. That comparator creates an error signal that goes to a controller, and that turns on the furnace. This keeps the temperature stable, or should. So this is the control system here, and these are the external factors. But this is the basis for all of those, not just thousands, but tens of thousands of control systems in our body. But it's not nearly this simple. It turns out if this is a simple thermostat just like that with nothing fancy, this is what you get. Wild fluctuations, way higher and lower than you want them. What you really want is something more like that, where the temperature only gets back, because stays very close to your preferred temperature. So how can you do that? So it turns out there are all these subtleties to control system regulation. There's an anticipator that sees the temperatures almost down to where the furnace should turn on, and it turns it on earlier. There are damping mechanisms to reduce swings. Allostasis, a term coined by Peter Sterling, who we'll talk in just a minute, adjusts the set points to changing conditions, such as it being colder outside. Then there are positive feedback switches that Perlman mentioned. I mean, mitosis, once it starts, it better finish. There's no point in stopping in the middle, just like childbirth. And eating too. You know, you eat one potato chip and you want to eat a whole lot more. There's a good reason for that. Positive feedback sets off a mechanism to structure our activity into bouts so that we don't waste time shifting back and forth between things. Then there's feed-forward mechanisms. A sweet taste releases insulin before any glucose gets to your system. And in fact, if you take the right kind of artificial sweeteners, you can set off your insulin response and lower your blood glucose because the body is tricked into thinking it's about to get a glucose load. And finally, and most important, a high gain in the system gets to the set point faster, but at the risk of instability. And that trade-off is intrinsic. And that's the huge point here, that trade-offs are intrinsic and problematic. This is the standard diagram that engineers use to try to create controllers that are optimal. They use the error signal to create a stimulus on the plant that is proportional to the amount of error. There's an integral that takes the past performance of the error into account, and a derivative that anticipates what's going to be happening as a result of those inputs to the plant. Turns out that even this is vastly simple compared to the newer kinds of control mechanisms. The mathematics are really lovely, even though inaccessible to most of us. Engineers use these, but here's the problem. That design systems are vastly different from evolved systems. The robustness of our evolved systems is thanks to myriad interconnected mechanisms. The robustness of design systems is because engineers are pretty smart and they build in backup systems. The fragility of evolved systems comes because maximizing performance is intrinsically at the cost of decreasing robustness and fitness sometimes. But fragility in design systems is because you can't have enough backups and every part is necessary unless you do have a backup to take care of it. Very different systems. And this means that you can't just apply fancy engineering calculus to the body because you can't measure the things that you need to measure to make it all work right. So the big question, and my question for my whole life, is why did natural selection leave us so vulnerable? Focused here on why are control systems so vulnerable? The big explanation, of course, is there are things selection can't do. Okay, that's important. Likewise, it's too slow. Another one is that fitness is maximized at the expense of health. But the two big ones I think that deserve further exploration are the path-dependent interdependency of control systems. They're so intertwined with each other that once you have strong selection to change one, such as neuronal migration for a brain that's evolving in response to language and cognition and social life, it really screws up all kinds of other things too. And then there are more fundamental trade-offs that cause intrinsic vulnerability. Big question at the core of all of this. So why do disease-associated alleles persist? Is it that they're mainly because of genetic drift and mutations and maybe a few balancing selection? Or is there something else here that we can turn to find a different kind of explanation? I think it's very worthwhile to try to look at failure modes in control systems. How do they fail? Positive feedback, we've already talked about. The scratch-itch cycle is an obvious further example. You scratch, it causes tissue damage, causes itch, on you go. Addiction, I mean, that's a lot of dermatologists' work, is try to interrupt that cycle. Addiction, one drink leads to two, especially with positive feedback, setting off that bouts of eating kind of thing. Then there are levels that are stable but too high. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and obesity all have something to do with external inputs that are unprecedented in our evolutionary history. Oscillation, essential tremor, is a very common problem. And notice that most of these things I'm talking about are highly heritable as a product of many, many genes, each of which has tiny effects. Then there are systems that have wild swings. Cyclothymia is moods that go too high and too low. Brittle diabetes and hypoglycemia. There are a lot of patients in the system, they fling back and forth from too high to too low. Then there's a response that's too slow. Some people, when they stand up, they faint because the system that's supposed to raise your blood pressure doesn't work fast enough. Obsessive compulsive disorder, I think, is especially ripe for examination because what's missing there is the off signal for stopping safety behavior that most of us have. and also very profound for psychiatry. And bipolar disorder is basically a problem of a bistable system that gets stuck at both extremes and has trouble staying in the middle. So this is my quick list of disorders that I think are ripe for analysis. Shulkin and Powers have already worked a lot on obesity, and we'll hear from Jay in just a moment. Chakravarti has written nicely on epilepsy and what it is about the tuning of the brain that leaves that system vulnerable to reentry. Cochrane has written bipolar disorder, much more to be done there. But all these others, I think, are just ripe for systematic approaches about the evolutionary reasons why control systems are intrinsically vulnerable to failure. This is a nice one by Katana, who's done marvelous work in the area. This is a diagram of metabolic syndrome. And I think the key here is showing that positive feedback loops in this diagram maintain and aggravate the syndrome once it gets going. This is very different from just saying exercise more and diet differently. And here's the final question. Does the intrinsic vulnerability of control systems help to explain disease heritability? And it turns out that Steve Frank, who really I think is the intellectual leader of this entire area, he's written a whole series of articles about control systems and evolutionary perspective. In a 2019 article titled Robust Error Correcting Feedback Increases Genetic and Phenotype Variability, he offers us a model in which those green dots, I can't really explain this in the amount of time available, but the gist of it is that when those dots are high on the y-axis, that means that they are, that's high heritability. And when they're low on the x-axis, that means that they are low in frequency. And in this model, an exceptionally well-controlled system leads to low rates of disease that are highly heritable. And he summarizes it by saying, increasing robustness reduces the frequency of system failures associated with disease and simultaneously causes a strong increase in the heritability of disease. I am just overwhelmed by the potential profoundness of this for all of the genetic studies that are going on now, trying to identify the reasons why disease-associated alleles persist. So coming back to the main point, I think this is an area ripe for a lot of good scientific work, and a lot of people are already on it. They're not as well connected with each other as they might be. And our goal in the next few minutes is to start that process. I'm going to stop my sharing, and I'm going to ask Meredith to sequentially call on people to offer very quick. We've offered them each 2 minutes to offer one example, and then we'll open it up to wider discussion. Meredith.